I want to thank you, Maddie, for just jogging around the aisles, bringing a mic to everybody. Worked so hard. And what a blessing that you brought to the church for doing that. And the Eno family for leading out today. I love to see the children up here, don't you? You guys love to see that? It just makes the Sabbath richer for me. And I just appreciate you sharing your talents, guitar playing and everything. It just, thank you for bringing that. I've discovered in my life that it seems like no matter what I'm about to do, it seems like that I have to prove myself some way. And I trust God into doing that. But sometimes I think I work too hard at it myself. When I was able to become a truck driver, my father-in-law was driving for Nicholson Trucking, and I tried to get a job there, and they weren't sure I was qualified because I didn't have any truck driving school, even though I ran heavy equipment all my life. They said, why don't you take and make a few runs with your father-in-law and we'll see how it works. And so we made one run to Phoenix and back, and by the time we got back, they said, well, I think we're ready to give you his truck, and you can go ahead and go on your own. So I took his truck, and they gave him a newer truck, and off I went. And I had heard so many stories about how hard these truckers work. I thought, okay, I've got to show that I'm a truck driver. And so they gave me a load to Albuquerque from Seattle, and I loaded up, and I drove straight through to Albuquerque, no stopping except for fuel. And from there, they go, wow, you're already there. Well, we got to load to San Diego. So they loaded me up, and off to San Diego I went. And then from there, they said, okay, let's load you to Phoenix. And I went to Phoenix, and I loaded up in Phoenix. And I don't remember where I was going from Phoenix, but I do remember this part. I got started off going through the desert, and suddenly I realized I was starving to death. I was just super hungry. I'm thinking, what did I have for breakfast? Oh, I didn't eat breakfast. What did I have for supper? Oh, I didn't have any supper. What did I have for lunch or breakfast yesterday? Oh, I didn't. And I kept going. I realized I hadn't eaten for 3 days. And I'm like, what? Who doesn't eat for 3 days? I wasn't trying to fast. I was just working so hard I forgot to eat. And so I'm looking around in the truck to see if there might be something in there. My father-in-law was good at leaving stuff around, but there was only one thing I could see. Underneath the seat back there was this half a loaf of dark rye bread that was dried and crusty. And I hated dark rye bread. It's like, oh, are you kidding me? Leaves the one thing I can't stand. And I'm looking and think, how far is it to a restaurant? Man, I have got to eat. And I'm thinking, man, it's a long ways. And I kept looking down at that loaf of bread and thinking, well, maybe just to satisfy my stomach a little bit, I'll just take a couple of bites of this dry, crusty bread. So I pulled up that half a loaf, and before I knew it, that whole loaf was gone. And to this day, I love dark rye bread now. God has an interesting way to change your palate, doesn't he? Well, you know, God says, I am the bread of life in John 6:35. And when he says that, sometimes him being the bread of life isn't necessarily to our palate, to our liking. And we know the story of all the disciples that he said that to them, and they left him. And he turns to the disciples and says, would you leave me too? And I love their response, don't you? Where will we go? The bread of life isn't always to our flavor, but I guarantee if you keep eating it, it will be to your liking. But when he says, I am the bread of life, they had to have references of what does he mean when he says, I am the bread of life. And as I think of the references, I'm thankful for your story today. The children, you didn't even know that I was going to talk about Elijah, did you? It's interesting, the story of Elijah. When I think about I am the bread of life, we know the story of Elijah. He comes onto the scene when he's challenged of God to go down to Ahab and tell him there's not going to be neither dew nor rain until the people turn away from their idol worship and come back, right? And so he goes and tells him that, and the threat of his life, because to go before the king unannounced means that your head is gone, lopped off. And so he leaves, and God directs him to the brook Cherith. And it's a wonderful story for you, everybody, to read in 1 Kings chapter 17. And it's a wonderful story of deliverance. It's interesting to me that he goes to this brook to get his water, and ravens bring him bread every morning and evening. And you think, wow, how would you like to wait for your meal to come out of the beak of a bird? Yeah, you would go one hand, Maddie, she was like that. It just seems interesting, that my food has been in the mouth of something else. But, it's like he's faithful to deliver this bread. And what went through my mind is I wonder, where did this raven steal the bread? Have you thought about that? Because they steal things. And I'm thinking, who came out to get their nice loaf of bread? What? It's gone. But we know that the Lord must have baked the bread for him because he's not into stealing. But I think it just seems, I have an imagination, a vivid imagination at times. And I thought, where was he getting this bread? Why didn't the Lord just make it and have it sit on the rock right there? Like we'll talk about in a second. From your story, you left out that part, but that's okay. That wasn't your emphasis. So,
I didn't say the angel fed him. I didn't say how.
Yeah, it was bread. The bread just showed up there in chapter 19, right? But the next step is the brook dries up, and so he's led to go to the widow of Zarephath, right? And so now he showed Elijah that it's not just about spiritual bread, that it is about physical bread. I will take care of you. Isn't it nice to know that God will take care of us? He says, I want you to seek first my kingdom and my righteousness, and I got the rest. And so here he is just kicking back, eating what God provides. And so now he's told to go to widow of Zarephath, and we see another part of this provision of bread. For he goes there again in chapter 17, and he tells the widow, after she says, well, I only have enough bread and oil to make food for my son and I, and then we die, right? And he says, well, make me a cake first. And it's interesting because now he brings faith into the bread. He brings faith into, will she believe that my God can multiply that and feed her? I love that challenge because now it brings not only physical bread into the scene, but it brings spiritual bread into the picture. And remember, the Jews know this story. They're familiar with this story. And so when he says, I am the bread of life, they recognize that it's physical and spiritual sustenance. It's both. And so it's a wonderful story. And then we see, in chapter 19, here he is, I'm the only one, and pouting. And God, he wakes up, and God here's his bread waiting for him. Here it is. God did a lot of giving to bread, Elijah, didn't he? We have 3 stories, just bink, 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 where he delivered bread. So when God says, I am the bread of life, we have some reference points in what he's asking of us. He's asking us to believe that all of our sustenance, he says, I will provide. Your faithfulness of believing that I provide that, you must share that with others. Share with them that I'm the bread of life, that I will take care of you in every way and leave nothing out. But the comparison that's used in John, we have to go there next, which is in Exodus. If you turn your Bibles to Exodus chapter 16, we pick up the story. Remember, Israel had just been delivered from Egypt, and they had gone across the Red Sea, and God had destroyed their enemies. And Moses writes a song, and then they are thirsty, and the water's bitter. And God does a miracle and makes the water not bitter. It's sweet and beautiful tasting. It's awesome. And now their provisions that they brought from Egypt are gone, and they're hungry. And when you're hungry, sometimes you forget how God had just led you in the past. All you can think of is the here and the now. You brought us out here to die. And so in chapter 16, we pick up this story starting in verse 4. It says, Then said the Lord unto Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my laws or no. Now, so you see how this is framed out in this very first verse here, that I may prove them. And here's the interesting part is we see, just like with Elijah, he's talking about physical food, and he's connecting it to spiritual food at the same time. Because what does manna have to do with you walking in the law or not? Are you seeing the difference, what the connection here? He says, to prove them that they may walk in my law. I thought we were talking about bread. I'm hungry. And now he's got the law in here. And you're thinking, wow, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my law. You see, God says, let me take care of you, and you will see that because I give you food, you should understand that I will give you the spiritual discernment you need to walk in my laws. Because we cannot walk in his law without his spiritual discernment. Without his spiritual guidance of putting the law in my heart, I can't walk in it. Do we get that picture? In other words, I need the bread of life. I need that bread of life to prove that I believe that he's providing for us. I believe that he will direct me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. I believe. That brings us to what? John 3:16, whosoever believeth in me shall not perish but have everlasting life. You see what that means? It ties it to the belief that he will indeed take care of us. So verse 5, he says, and it shall come to pass that on the 6th day that they shall prepare that which they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. So before he gives them the law on Sinai, because people incorrectly believe that that's when they first get the law. Well, how could they keep the law if they didn't know the law? And how could he have them try to remember the Sabbath when they didn't know the Sabbath? And here he's establishing the Sabbath and how important it is to get ready for the Sabbath. Before he speaks the law, before he writes it with his finger, he's already challenging them and helping them set aside the Sabbath day. Isn't that cool? So we know that they understood it. They already knew it. The law was not a mystery to them. But they had indeed forgotten for the most part. They had been under slavery for so long that it had become very dim in their thinking. And so he wanted to make it very prominent in their thinking. He wanted them to realize, look I've got you, and I'm going to prove it so that you might prove me and walk in my laws. And so he wanted to show them the Sabbath and how integral it was in this whole idea of him being the bread of life for them. We pick up the story now. We'll jump down to verse 14. It says, and when the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing, as small as a hoarfrost on the ground. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, it is manna. And of course, manna means, what is it? And so when we look at what God gives us many times, we declare that it's manna. We don't know what it is. When he says, I am the bread of life, sometimes we just don't know what it is. What is it? And he wants us to, by faith, eat it, whether it's spiritual or physical, because God has provided it. And so here he's going through this dialogue with them, and they're looking at it with wonder. And in verse 16 it says, this is the thing which the Lord hath commanded, not suggested, he commanded it, gather of it every man according to his eating, an omer for every man according to the number of your persons. Take ye every man for them which are in thy tents. And so now he's commanded them, you got to gather this up. Every morning they got to gather it. And there's spiritual implications tied to this, as he brings out in John chapter 6. The reality is that every morning we need to gather our manna. We do. He doesn't want us looking around and have to look down and just find a dried up loaf of dark rye bread. He wants us to have fresh bread every morning. He wants us to look at it for it with delight, knowing that I read this in the morning, for that's my sustaining energy, spiritual energy for the day. You don't try to get energy at the end of your day. You need to get energy before you start your day. And you can't say, well, I read Monday and I'm too busy Tuesday. What happens to your manna, the Bible says? It gets worms and it's spoiled. And so we need fresh manna every day. And so when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, he's saying, I am that fresh nutrition that you need every day to be ready to face the day. For me, there's some people who aren't breakfast people, and I don't understand that. But I'm a breakfast person, and when I eat my breakfast, I feel ready to face my day. I eat a good nutritional breakfast that I get to thank my wife for putting together, because if I did it, it wouldn't be so nutritious. It'd be just a bowl of dry cereal. And so I'm grateful that God has provided a wife who cares for me. And I have a breakfast that gives me strength to carry on through the day, and I'm so grateful for that. And God says, I want to give you that strength. He's provided the bread, the nutrition that I need, my physical needs. Do we remember to thank God for those physical needs? When he says, I am the bread of life, he wants you to look at the bread, the physical bread he's given you, and say, wow, look what God has put before me. He wants you to do that, not forget. Today in Sabbath school, we were talking about the breath. Mike brought that out, that when I hear the word God, the Lord, it's about breath. I breathe today because God. I am alive today because God. Isn't that wonderful? So the name God reminds you of his creative power, that I breathe today because of God. Well, you eat today because of God. Again, so the provisions that he's made, both spiritually and physically, we look and say, wow, God, you are truly worthy to be praised. Truly worthy. Isn't that neat? Everything should direct your eyes to God to praise him, whatever it is. And he's trying to get Israel to waken up. And you and I were spiritual Israel. So he's trying to get us to what? Waking up, to come awake, to see and to praise God for the breath, for the food, for the spiritual direction that he's given us in our life. We jump down to verse 27 and 28. It says, and it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day for to gather, and they found none. And the Lord said unto Moses, how long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? Do you see how he's put, again, physical and spiritual? They cannot be separated. They're tied in together. And he says, you reject to keep my laws. I tell you, if you will do this, I will take care of you. And they turn away from what God has said, and they go to try to accomplish against what he has said. And so this teaches us and shows us that what God says, he will do. And if we don't believe him, and we go out thinking, well, last time I gathered twice as much on a Monday, I just spoiled, so I don't believe that if I gather twice as much on Friday, that it won't spoil. You see, we don't believe in God's sustaining power. You see, his sustaining power is for our physical as well as our spiritual. You see how they're tied together? You can't untie them. They're linked. And so our physical food is dependent upon God. Our spiritual food is dependent upon God. We owe him everything. And so he compares that in John chapter 6. He's comparing that I am that living manna. So let's turn now to John chapter 6. Now that we've got ourselves orientated with what he's comparing himself to and what they remember from Elijah, we're going to look at this journey now before he tells them that I'm the bread of life, that we want to set the stage again. What is he trying to teach them? John chapter 6. And we realize that there's an interesting journey that they've taken before he says this to them. So we find here in John chapter 6, verses 5 and 6, he's got this multitude of people that have followed him, and he realizes that they're hungry. He says, okay, these people are hungry. We need to feed them. I'm going to tell my disciples this, and let's see how they respond to the need of the people. So let's look at that. He says, when Jesus, verse 5, when Jesus lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, he said unto Philip, well, how are we going to buy this bread that they may eat? He asked him this question, how are we going to do that? God asked us that question as well, and how they respond should open up our eyes to think, well, how would we respond? How would we respond when you look at, you got 5,000 people and God says, how are we going to feed them? So he doesn't tell him what he's going to do yet, because he already knows what he's going to do, but he wants to ask you, because he wants to get you thinking and trusting in him. And so he asked him this question. And he said in verse 6, and he said this to prove him, for himself knew what he would do. So Philip answered and says, well, 200 penny worth of bread is not sufficient for them. So what does Philip do when he asks this question? He looks into his purse and then looks and he goes, well, we don't have enough in here. 200 penny worth is not going to even come close to it. And so what was Philip looking at? What was he looking at? The physical realities, right? Physical, like, I don't have enough money to do what you asked me to do. And I have to ask myself, how often do we not respond to God because we look in the purse and we're like, I don't got enough money to do that. I don't have enough. Do we believe? You see, the challenge is our faith. Do I believe that what God can do, that he will do for me and what he asked me to do? So he's asking Philip, what are we going to do? And Philip, all he can think of is that we don't have enough to do this. It's a crazy question. And then in verse 8, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said unto him, well, there's a lad over there, with 5 loaves and a couple of fishes. But what good is that? He's trying to say, look at this is all we got is this little dab of food that I see here. I don't see anybody else with a lunch. This guy, his mom really loved him, and so he made a lunch for him. And the other moms didn't love the other ones out there. And so here he is with this one band. He's looking and says, look, all we have is this little bit. Is that what we do? God, all I have is this little bit. How dare you ask me to know how to do something that's impossible? Because all of the spiritual journey that we're on is impossible for you and I to do. Everything that he commands us to do is impossible for us to do without the bread of life, Jesus. And he wants them to recognize that by looking and sowing. Where do we first look? When God says to do something, we first look at what is our possibilities. What is our reality? What am I able to do? That's the first thing we do. Tell me that's not true. That is true. That's the first thing. Our first reaction is just like these disciples. We look at what God says to do and we think, I don't have enough money. We only got this one little basket of food. God's asked us to reach Ottawa. How deep into our pockets are we reaching? How deep into faith are we reaching? Should be the real question. Because our pockets will not be full enough. Neither will our baskets of food be enough. And so here's these challenges that he puts before them. And so when we look at these challenges that are there, we're kind of set back. What do we do? And of course, we know the story. He divides this up and he feeds all of them. And when he's done feeding them, we find in verse 11, he takes the loaf and he distributes them around the fishes. But in verse 12, he says, when they were filled to their full as their tummies were full. And he said unto the disciples, now gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. That's always amazed me, that part right there. Like, what? Gather up? We only had one basket to start with, and now we're going to have 12 baskets full? What are we going to do with that? You see, God promises that his blessings will be so much that you won't be able to receive it all. It's going to be greater than you can even imagine. Fuller, because he is that bread of life. He is life indeed, our all in all. And when we contemplate the power of God, we can't grasp the power. It's too great. And so he feeds the 5,000, and we know what happens next is Jesus wants to go pray, and the disciples get in a boat, and they go out into the lake, and a storm comes up, and Jesus walks on water. He walks on water. This is all before he says, I'm the bread of life. And so here he walks on water, gets into the boat, they get to the other side, and the other people on the other side of the lake, they look and say, well, how did Jesus get over there? Because we know he didn't get in the boat, and they're kind of shocked. How did he? We know the disciples got into the boat by themselves, but yet he's there. And so they get boats and they go over there and some hike around. And until you're there at Galilee, it's hard to grasp this story, by the way. When you're there, you realize you can stand there on the shore and you can see clearly the other side. When I think of that sea, I always think of it as this big body of water that's just, huge. Because the storms, you've got to think, well, it's got to be this huge body of water. But it's not. It's not that big. And you can just look right across this, right out the other side. There it is. I'm like, okay. Before I read the story and I couldn't grasp it. I thought, well, how did he even know? And then I realized how small it is. Okay. Now I see how can they know. Because it's easy to see. You can see all the boats. You can tell that there was no other way. There's only a boat that went. So they got these other ones and they went. So here, the miracle of that is astounding. In fact, when they get to the other side, they're going, how did you get here? They're asking him how he got there. Because he shouldn't be able to have gotten there because there was no boat for him to take. And it was too fast for him to have walked all the way around to the other side. So he had to get there somehow. How did he do it? And so these miracles that had just been done. So we have to realize, let's look at the miracles. He had fed the 5,000. He had walked on water, calmed the sea, and now he's over here on the other side. So this is the setting, if you will, about before he tells them that I am the bread of life. And so let's pick up this story here, starting in verse 26. They'd ask him the question, how are you here? In verse 26, he answered, verily, verily, I say unto you, you seek me, not because you saw the miracle, because you did eat of the loaves and were filled. So he's talking to what group of people? All that were fed, all the great multitude that had come across. They wanted more. But because you were filled. So what was it that the people wanted? Spiritual food or physical food? They wanted physical food. They just wanted their tummies to be satisfied, and that would be good enough. That's what they were after. He says it wasn't about the miracle. It was simply about your tummy being filled. In other words, the miracle just kind of went over their head. It's like they didn't even grasp the power that it took to multiply those loaves and fishes. It was just like, I'm satisfied. That's what matters, not how it happened. Isn't that amazing? It's like they missed the miracle even. It's like, well, my tummy's full. Yeah, anybody could have done that. But, he did it, so let's follow him around. And so in verse 27, he says, labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for that meat which is endureth unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you, for him hath God the Father sealed. And so here's the counsel for you and me. We go to work every day to buy what? Perishable food. And maybe some of you have this bumper sticker, I owe, so off the work I go. It's just about that. Is that our cycle? You see, Jesus is trying to challenge that cycle. We should go to work not that we can buy and pay our bills, but he wants us to go to work that we might share him with whatever our vocation is. How are we going to share people about a God who puts food on my table, even if it takes a raven to bring it? Are you seeing that picture? He's saying, share with people the miracle of the food on your table. It is I that have brought it. You didn't work for it. You worked for me, and I brought it. Remember, Elijah worked for him, and who brought the food? God did. He's the raven to bring it. Are you following the picture here? And so they know the stories. They know the impossibility to feed the 5,000. They know that no one can walk on water. They can't grasp that. And yet all their minds can grasp is a physical bread. And so in verse 28, he says, then they said unto him, what shall we do that we might work the works of God? This is normal human response. What do I do to earn salvation? Is there anything you can do to earn salvation? Oh, it's a gift. God says, I've given it to you. You just need to accept it and believe that I'm going to take care of you. It's accepting the gift of God. We can never earn it. Because if I was able to earn it and you didn't get it, that means I worked harder than you. Sorry for you. If you guys had just watched me work, then you could have it too. Then who am I pointing to? Jesus? No, I'm pointing to me as the example. Because I've worked hard enough to get it, and if you're not getting it, then you need to work as hard as me. And so they're saying, what must we do? What must we do? Verse 29, and Jesus said unto them, this is the work of God, that you believe on him whom he has sent. And so they wanted to know how to get this bread, and here he brings them right to what? You just need to believe that I got all that. Just as I fed Elijah, I will feed you. Just as I fed the children of Israel with manna, I will feed you. But it's about a spiritual journey more than the physical. And so verse 30, they said unto him, therefore, what sign do you show us then, that we may see and believe that you're the worker? What work you do? What are you going to do? Doesn't that sound just unbelievable? What sign are you going to show us? Well, what did they just see? They completely missed the power of God at work. All they could resolve is that my tummy was full. That's it. Wow. I look at that and I think, what's going on here? You see, they didn't even recognize the spiritual manna, because he says, our fathers did eat manna in verse 31 in the desert, as it is written. He gave them bread from heaven to eat. So that's what we want. We don't want anything but you to just keep feeding us physically every day, like in the wilderness. That's what we want. We want to see that manna just come down every day, and we can just play. We don't have to do anything, because we know the manna is going to show up. Yeah. This is what they want. And they're like, look at, they had manna. And so, well, didn't he just rain manna down from heaven for them, for the 5,000? Really? He just did that. He took that little loaves and fishes and fed 5,000 with them. That's huge. That's no less of a miracle than manna coming down from heaven. It's no less of a miracle. And yet they could not see it. They have blinders on their eyes. And brothers and sisters, I believe that too often we have blinders on our eyes. And we're working too hard to put bread on the table that God says, I will deliver. Do you believe that he can deliver your bread? Do you believe it? Are you waiting for that miracle? God's waiting to give it. But we don't let him, because we're too busy delivering the bread ourselves rather than working for them. And so we get here to verse 32. Then Jesus said unto them, verily, verily, I say unto you, Moses gave you that bread from heaven, but my Father giveth you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he which cometh down from heaven and giveth life unto the world. And so here he's trying to draw their attention. Look at, God has sent his Son. We have decided this, and here I am to give you life. And yet you don't see it. You've missed the point. You've missed everything that is done. And so what do they want? They still don't see the spiritual. Then they said unto him, Lord, evermore give us this bread. They still didn't even hear what he said. And too often when we read God's word, we really don't hear what he says. He's asking us to eat the word of God, to really digest it, to really absorb his word and say, Lord, I know that you have my best interest in mind, that you have everything taken care of in my life. Before the world was created, you knew what you wanted to do with me. You already had it in place if I just let you use it. And unfortunately, we don't believe him. And we work ourselves to death trying to get what God wants to deliver. We work so hard during the week that when the Sabbath comes, we find ourselves unable to stay awake and listen and learn and receive the blessing of God. If you find yourself overly tired on the Sabbath, I want to challenge you right now to get on your knees this week and pray that you will use only God's energy during the week, that you can then have your energy with him combined, a double portion on Friday, to receive the blessing that he longs to give you. That's what he's saying. That's what he's telling us. You gather a double portion on Friday. And they just simply wanted physical bread because everlasting life wasn't in their thinking. They already had that. They're children of Abraham. And we already have it. We're Seventh-day Adventist. Sorry, that title won't get you into heaven. Just like being a child of Abraham won't get you into heaven. Unless you're truly a child of Abraham. That means by faith. That's how you walk, believing that God will provide. And so now verse 35. And Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. So what did he just tell you here in that verse after all that we talked about? What did he just tell you? He that cometh to me, do you have to worry about your bread on your table? It might be a loaf of dark rye bread that you don't like yet. But yet you will feast on it and learn to like it. Or maybe it's just a scrumptious meal that you like to begin with. You don't know what that's going to be, but we know that God will provide it. And he says, I want to feed you spiritually. And how can we be feasting spiritually? Like the manna, I have to gather this every day. Feast on this word. He says, if you feast on this word, looking for me, looking to find me in this word, you will be full. You will be satisfied, and your belief system will grow, and you won't worry about the bread on your table because I got that. You will go to work not to say, I go to off to work, I go because to pay my bills. You will be going to work and say, Lord, who am I going to show your glory to today? That's what your work will be. Not, oh, man, if they just give me a raise, I could buy more food. God's got that, brothers and sisters. Quit looking for that raise and trust God to give you just what you need. Go and serve him. Go and share Jesus to the world and where he's put you. He's put you right where you need to be to share the glory of God, to give the bread of life to the widow of Zarephath, to bring them the glory of the kingdom. Wherever God's taken you, he says, I am that bread of life. And when we partake and when we eat that bread, the spiritual bread, and believe that the physical bread he's provided, our faith will grow, and we will spend our life not spinning our wheels for that which God will provide and trying to provide it for ourselves, but we will glory in the righteousness of Jesus, and we will have something truly to give to the world.
If you'll join us for our closing song, hymn number 626, In a Little While We're Going Home. Sorry, I forgot to write down. You want to stand with me?
Seeing